Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me this Friday evening. And we're going to talk a little bit about capstones and case studies and things of that nature. This specifically is for sort of the springboard or possibly boot camp at large audience. And this will cover some of the things that I wish I had known at the very beginning regarding the case study and how I could have worked a bit smarter, worked a bit better. You know, you always want to work smarter and not harder. And so I went ahead and put together sort of a slide deck in Figma. That's what I had open. And I went and just gave this a quick and dirty title of Capstone and Case Study, Things I Wish I'd Done. So this shouldn't be a very long one. And of course, if there's any questions or concerns, be sure to drop those in the chat. I do have a separate monitor here so I can watch what's going on. And of course, you can find me on LinkedIn or any other avenues. Follow me on Twitch, so on and so forth. So we'll go ahead and get started. And let's see here. So we'll begin with some just general case study tips. And now, I did not come up with all of these, of course. These are some of my own observations. However, I do attend, or I have been attending, some of the fireside chats, and some of the alumni there have been incredibly helpful in giving some very broad and also very specific hints and tips as to how to make this process of distilling everything down that you've done in the capstone into a case study that the hiring manager will want to read, or at the very least be able to skim through and glean the most important information. And so these are in no particular order. So the first one being, you want to go ahead and start wherever you are in the process, whether you're just starting the capstone or a new project, whatever that case looks like, or you might be at the very end of your project or capstone, in which case, congratulations. I'm sure it was months of challenging work. However, it's better to start writing and taking notes at the beginning. And of course, if you are going through boot camp, oftentimes you are required to have a reflection document here and there. However, I would go a bit above and beyond as far as what is required and maybe make some more personal notes about the process, what you got stuck on, what you found easy. And it's all about reflection. And, it kind of boils down to, as it says here, I made this design decision because of, this reason, or I rejected this design idea for these reasons, whatever that looks like. And the reflection process not only will, because a lot of these things are, you can make a design decision and then 3 months later completely forget why you did it. So you want to be able to look back and get into the headspace that you were in at the time of design, and remind yourself why you made these decisions when you were forks in the road or whatever that situation was. And as far as keeping a sort of a diary of artifacts is concerned, you'll have your notes here, but also I would suggest, especially if you're using a program like Sketch or Figma or Adobe XD, have a separate document where you're able to copy and paste iterations of the designs that you're working on. So you yourself, when you go back months later, you can see changes over time. And I wouldn't necessarily, if you have a design and you move one element 1 or 2 pixels to the right or to the left, I wouldn't necessarily add that to an iteration document, because that won't be terribly helpful, and you'll end up with a document of tremendous file size. So I wouldn't necessarily do something like that. But when you make a major change, document that in such a way that you can go back, and that in combination with any notes that you might write will better help you understand the process that you used, and you'll be able to maybe even use some of that copy, a bit of the text you wrote in the case study. And it's useful for hiring managers, hiring administration, to be able to, if they happen to have the time to read too deeply into your case studies, they'll get a sense that you were able to, use design thinking and determine between one design pattern and the other, or this color versus that color, font size, font weight, white space, whatever that looks like. So it shows your cognition in the process, and it lets them know that you understand design thinking and that you're using it, and which is incredibly useful in this line of work. So another big tip here would be, aside from that, showing why you did something, why you didn't do something, you'll also want to write down, or at least make some sort of note referring to processes where you had a convergence and a divergence. So, for example, if you are in a brainstorming session, or you're going through a phase or a unit that requires coming up with a large amount of ideas, then you're in the situation where you're coming up with a great number of ideas. That is to say, problems to a solution would be a good way to think about that. You want to show how you came up with all those ideas, and then also how you were able to converge on a single idea or one or two key ideas. In what way did you separate the wheat from the chaff as far as design decisions are concerned? How did you decide what works best, what doesn't work best? And another thing to take into account is, and this completely I didn't think about this at all until I was attending one of these fireside chats, and one of the issues that was mentioned was when we are discussing toward the end of the main problem-solving process, closer to the results area of the case study. If you're designing if you're doing a capstone for a boot camp or some other sort of educational track, not only did you probably work alone, or you may have had a small team where everyone has multiple hats at any given point, the product you made might not have gotten, depending on who you went through, might not reach the full development cycle. For example, I've been working on, I've been working on an app, I've been working on a project for about 3.5 months now, something like that. Maybe 4, I'm not entirely sure. Time's a mystery. And I know, I'm treating it like, like it's a real app that's going to be developed. I know that at a certain point, the work stops. It doesn't, there is no handoff period for me. I do not give a bunch of, exported icons and vectors and screens to a back-end or front-end development team like that. That's not going to happen. And so it just gets to a certain point and it stops. And so obviously that, the app, quote unquote, that I've been working on for all these months isn't going to end up on any app store for any operating system. That's just not going to happen. If I had the resources, that is to say time, money, that would be, I would like to see it. I think it's a worthwhile idea. However, knowing that it's never going to be released, at least not right now, there's an issue of how do I then measure success? What do results actually look like? And that could be, incredibly difficult, because no one except the people who have done usability testing, or your friends and family, no one's ever going to see this outside of a portfolio. And it's either going to be, a small video of what it could look like, or it might be a GIF representing an animation sequence, or it could be just a static image like a JPEG or something like that. And so there are a couple ways to get around that, and you may opine about what the results could be, or you could extrapolate on the data that you have so far from your series of tests. The last testing I'll be doing is the usability tests for the animated high fidelity prototype, and so I can introduce additional questions into my usability test script to acquire information about what it might look like if this app is going to get released. So I could come up with, I could imagine what results might look like in the real world. And as far as, and that ties heavily into this quote here that I took from the Zoom chat last night. One of the peers in our group, Jamie W., she's helping out a lot of the students. She made the observation that you can also turn participants into metrics, and that was, I thought that was rather clever. And so it would be not misleading, and it would be completely, fine for you to put into a case study something like, I'm going to quote her poorly, but 8 out of 10 participants in the battery of tests said that they liked X, Y, and Z, or that they would use the specific app for these reasons. And so you could have metrics derived from what you find during your testing phases. And with that, you'll be able to fill in some of the gaps that you wouldn't necessarily be able to offer in your case study, because in a scenario like this anyway, the project that you're working on isn't going to ever meet like full fruition, I guess you could say. It's never going to be released. And so if you can think of ways to, if you can conceptualize what results could possibly look like, or what an effect or an impact your work may have, you can devise questions and weave them into your testing. And so you can come up with these metrics that could have could positively affect your case study, because you don't want to be without that sort of section, because it would be less than what a hiring manager is looking for, I would imagine. And so the point right here, the penultimate bullet point here is stay portfolio minded, which has sort of been the theme with this last little bit of me speaking here. Everything that you do, every design decision that you make, every sketch that you write out, all of your UI patterns, decisions, anything you put pixel to screen, these have a potential to end up on your portfolio. And even things you might not expect. You could think, when you're done, I wish I had included, this artifact, that artifact, this bit of text, whatever the case may be. So always keep it in the back of your mind that you are going to present this work in some form or fashion. And so the more artifacts or meta artifacts that you're able to cultivate, the easier that's going to be for you. You'd be in a much nicer situation in having many screenshots to choose from that show a lengthy iteration process, versus not having many and having to go back to previous designs. Imagining, if you got to your, for example, if you got to your high fidelity mock-up stage and you looked back at the, your design history, what got you to that point, and the only artifacts or deliverables that you have are the final versions of whatever process that was, like sketching or wireframing or user flows, red routes, navigation, anything like that. If you only have the final version of what led to the next step, then you're not going to, it's going to be harder for you to think, how did I begin this? What did this look like at the very beginning, if you only have the final product from that unit or from that step in the design process. So think in a manner that's, you want to set yourself up for success. So you're going to want to have these artifacts lying around. Worst case scenario, you just won't use them and you take up a little bit of hard drive space, but I don't think that's much of a concern these days. And I did, of course, this entire time I've been speaking so far, I have made a pretty big deal about the importance of, writing everything down, reflect. and just have, lengthy documents about this, that, and the other thoughts, ruminations on the design process. That is not to say your copy that you're creating is going to make it to the eyes of the hiring manager. As has been pointed out multiple times, among other things, you, specifically with regarding to the portfolio, you might have 1 or 2 seconds to grab someone's attention. And if it falls out of that window of time, it's just not going to happen. And so one of the biggest mistakes I made was, given my background, I like writing, I enjoy writing. And when I began my case study, I was just sort of freestyling it the whole time, just writing whatever came into my head and then going back and editing portions of it so it actually, it's cohesive. And I assure you, I type and I compose better than I speak on stream. However, I realized at one point that I had written, or I had taken close to like 8 or 9 pages about, what is information architecture, and the finer points, and I was getting into sort of philosophy and psychological notions about different aspects. And I realized after talking to some of my peers, some of the alumni, that may be fun for me, and indeed it is, but no one has time for that. No one cares. And it's especially, it's folly to try to explain the idea of something like information architecture, for example, to someone who's in a position of being, who's in a position to hire, because it may not be the case, but more often than not, they know it. They know what IA is. They don't need you retelling them or giving them a purple prose, flowery history of the history of information architecture. It's just no one wants that. That's not useful to anybody. And so while it may be enjoyable, it may not. I might be the rare one on this. I would love to write, the novel of how a 3-month project came into being. Anybody who's going to hire you does not want that weighing on them. And so as far as the actual deliverable case study copy is concerned, as it says at the bottom there, just hit the highlights and move on. Don't waste people's time. You don't want people, and I'm not saying that to be rude or mean, but you'll need to learn to, and I'm sort of speaking to myself here, learn to edit yourself, learn to pare down. You want to distill or crystallize the most meaningful content that you can. And so, bullet points, sort of a tweet-like structure, which I'll get to in a moment here. These are definitely things that you'll want to use, mindsets that you'll want to have, excuse me, in order to maximize the success as far as someone reading and understanding what you're getting at in your case study. So next slide here. Yes. The entire, I guess, one of the big points in all of this is, if you, especially with the case study, because it seems like there's so many portions of it that can go wildly out of control. If you don't plan your work your plan. And I think another famous saying or aphorism is, if you fail to plan, then you plan to fail. And that is especially true at this stage, because it's, writing a case study may seem like a nearly insurmountable task, and certainly depending on the scope of the project, there could be an entire team working on writing the case study. I've looked at case studies that are hundreds of pages long. One in particular was 80 pages long, which took an incredible, it looked amazing, and it was fun to read. However, teams are behind these things, and so you have to understand your limitations and the scope you're working in, or the scope you're working inside of, to sort of keep it manageable. And while I would not suggest just jumping in and start writing every now and then, I'll have thoughts that jump to my head every now and then, so I'll just hop in Google Docs and write out a phrase that I thought of that would explain this process better, or why I did this better. However, you'll want a formal plan in place to maximize efficiency, because it's quite easy to just spend an endless amount of time. The hours will just peel away if you allow yourself to just, again, just sort of freestyle on the keyboard and come up with, 10,000 words about, the history of WebAIM, or how that relates to your project, or whatever that may look like or sound like. And so what I would suggest is definitely, it may not be the very first thing that you do, but one of the first things that you do would be to start an outline. And this is my exact outline, excuse me. Gracious. This is my exact outline. Over here on the left, and I doubt highly, this is almost impossible for me to read on my much, on the screen in front of me. I know what all these things are because I wrote them myself, but this is what I started with. And it took maybe, I don't know, between half an hour and an hour to review the entirety of the stepwise process that I went through to get to the point where I am now. That is basically, finishing up the first capstone, working on the usability testing, which would be the last phase of testing from what I can tell. And so this is from very beginning to very end of the entirety of the app that I was creating. And again, this is not conducive to a case study that any hiring manager or anyone in that position is going to want to read or really get anything out of. If you have, if your job involves looking at 30, 40, 50, 60 resumes per day, that gives you an extremely limited amount of time to spend on each one. And so if you grab a resume or a CV to look at, and you notice that the table of contents looks like this, that's not going to work. You might spend your entire time block or your allotted time per resume just trying to figure out the exact structure of what's going on here. So that's not going to fly. Also, just for you as the person the designer who is writing the case study, this is going to be not unmanageable, because if it's formatted correctly, if it's structured properly, you can take this step by step and it'll be fine. However, it'll be easier for both you and whoever it is who possibly, hopefully, would be hiring you to come up with a reduced outline, which is what I was able to take this insurmountable wall of text and put it over here. And it is still a lot. I understand that. And there could be some areas where I could do some more conglomeration of ideas. However, I liked the way that I was able to break this up, and I spoke to my mentor about this, and he agreed that this looked it looked more meaningful, and it seemed like it was a lot easier to navigate, both for me as the person who will end up writing all this, and for anyone who's going to be viewing it. And so many of these items over here can be put together in just one block, one unit. And indeed, some of these things, as it turns out, didn't matter at all, or they had such a small impact on the project, regardless of what I thought about them. Their overall impact on the completed project was minimal. It was in the bottom percentile of things that actually mattered. That they may be worth a sentence or two somewhere in the entire case study, but they don't get they do not deserve, all deliverables are important, but some are much, much more important than others. And so that's up to you as the designer to prioritize what meant the most in your design journey, and also to figure out what didn't mean that much, or not to say that portions of the work didn't have much of an impact, but you want to prioritize portions of your work or aspects of your work that mattered more than others, because that's going to, you'll be able to speak on it with greater zeal, and it'll show in your writing. And hiring managers, that's something that they'll be looking for. And as you can see, it can get deep. I think it gets, there's 2A, 2A3, and then 2A1. So at some point when I'm talking about, I grouped affinity maps, empathy maps, and personas all together. That's still 4 deep. And so I am sort of working on a way to not have as many layers to this. However, this is a drastic improvement compared to the old outline. And of course, obviously, feel free to use this. This is just from my own mind. Bear in mind, your design outline may require additional steps that I didn't have here, or I may have done things that you didn't do. So, this is just more of an example of what it could look like. Yours definitely doesn't need to. There are no rules in this. This is just what happened to work for me so far. And the big points to or the big takeaways from this, the way this is structured, is if you look here, you'll see introduction has 3 sub-steps, and then if you skip process and go to the end, there's conclusion, and then sort of late into this design, I did add, I'll have a link for the, as I was speaking about earlier, the gallery of artifacts that I created, and I'll put that in a FigJam document, so it'll be very accessible for whoever wants to take a look at that. But you'll notice that process, which is, there's one portion which is dedicated to considering the problem, doing the research, all that good stuff, and the solution, that is to say, the product that I designed. This takes up the majority of the case study, and indeed, that is the part that whoever is hiring, that's what they'll care about the most, because this is where most of the, this is where the work went in, and so this is where all your hours went. And this is the story of your deliverables, and it's a story of problems and solutions, and you'll want to be able to sell that as best you can. So this will be the bulk of your work here. And I grabbed this graphic from what is it? Yeah, UXPortfolioFormula.com apparently, and this is sort of reinforces what was on this previous slide here, and that this process portion is going to be by far the bulk of your writing work. And on this graphic, the process is the what happened. It's this big purple block right here, which is as stated up here in this table, process and what you did, which is a step-by-step rundown of what you did and why you did it. And I will talk more about a little bit about that in a moment, those being 2 key things. And so just based on this graphic alone, we can determine just how much importance is placed on this middle portion, that is to say, the process, the steps, the deliverables. And all these other items are, very important as well. Not to say they're not important, they certainly are. They pale in contrast, or they pale in comparison to the process portion. However, this is significantly easier to write than this middle portion, and some of this stuff is just you plug in nouns and verbs, and it's as good as any other. And then conclusion, this is your outcomes and your results, and possibly what you learned, what you could have done better, what you would do next time, things of that nature. So that won't be a very large component, as would be indicated. It's actually the smallest compared to introduction. However, this is where you would, if you don't have real world metrics like daily average users or anything like that, this is where you would put in metrics you derived from specific questions in your testing, or sort of come up with ideas about what your results might look like, or what your outcomes could be in a case where any project that you're working on actually does get released and appears on an app store and is downloaded and used by people. And as far as so this is this area, or this slide right here, the process pattern. I spent a decent amount of time trying to come up with an idea of what I wanted each discrete section of the process portion of the case study to look like. That is to say, the process portion being this big purple what happened. And this, again, purple portion right here, the what happened, is going to be each of these line items, more or less. So there's going to be a section dedicated to secondary research. There's going to be a section dedicated to problem statements, IA, red route, sketching, so on and so forth. And because each of these are going to be separate from each other, I'm going to show a stepwise process. I wanted to determine early on or after the outline phase how I was going to design those blocks of content. And because I thought that would further aid me in the writing process. And I was able to, with some help and with looking at other portfolios, especially those of successful UX, UI designers and people who had jobs that were similar to what I would like to have, I noticed that many of them, not all, bear in mind there's a lot of area for not play in this area. This is by no means law or anything. This is just what I found out. And it seemed like many of them took this pattern where they would start, and so the order of this is also up in the air. It's variable and optional, as I state here. Some of these are more important than others. For example, I saw that many case studies and portfolios included a breadcrumb, because regardless of how small you're able to, or how concise you're able to make your case study, there's still going to be some scrolling going on or possibly some page turning. And whenever that's the scenario, you want to orient the user, that is to say the person who's reviewing your case study. You want to orient them and remind them of where they are in the process, even if they if they are designers, they'll know where you are. It's helpful to keep that forefront. And I do have a screenshot of an example of what this looks like all together next, but I want to get through explain the remaining lines here. The process would be the name of the process, and so this would say something like red routes or high fidelity mockups, not high definition, high fidelity, followed by. And this is very much in vogue right now, and it seems like a pretty good idea. This is before you get to your copy, you would have a subhead. So we called it in the newsroom. You would have a subhead, which is a very short version of what you're about to say. And I've seen it written numerous times on many websites dedicated to case study writing, UX, UI analysis, that the Twitter style is a good way of thinking of this when you are writing your subhead, or sort of a too long did not read, because if they don't have, if whoever's looking at hiring people doesn't have time to read the paragraph of copy or the body text for the copy, they will read the subhead. And about 140 characters is about right. I've written some that had fewer characters than that, and I think I had one that was about 180 characters long, but I couldn't reduce it any more than that. And so this is going to be, it'll vary between topics and subjects, and sometimes it'll be more, sometimes it'll be less. I wouldn't necessarily hold yourself to any one, set in stone character or word count or anything like that, but know that this will be very handy for any hiring personnel, because they'll be able to quickly grasp what you're speaking about or what this section is about, and then move on to the next. Again, it's a time saving measure. After that would be your actual body text, your copy, and this is where you would want to write in a concise style. You would want to, and a couple of ways to do that would be minimizing or outright banning the use of like adverbs, adjectives, definitely no intensifiers. That's just bad writing in general. And you want to distill down, not as much as you can, but you want to definitely put your most important ideas about whatever the process is here in concise copy. And this is where you will include things, this is where you definitely want to hit the highlights, what the task is, very brief explanation, because again, people who are looking at this will know what the task is, why you perform the task, the findings generated or discovered after the task was complete, and the impact that this task had on the project as a whole, which can be, again, if you're doing this as you go, if you're writing case study notes as you go, that last part, the impact part, may be difficult to understand, but that will become clearer later. So I wouldn't worry about that too much, at least at that part of the writing process. And one way to grab attention is to use, so when people are reading like documents online, say on Medium, or I was going to say Behance, but that's not correctly, any not necessarily a long form article, but if it's an article where you have to scroll, people, especially those who don't have much time, are looking at text elements that jump out. And so that would be headlines, subheads, images are huge. Quotes are often they're put in quote spaces, and they're usually sometimes in different colors. Bullet points are sort of summaries of what's going on or what's being talked about. And so in the skimming process, when people are reading just as quick as they can, they'll pay attention to those sorts of things. And so you want to include them, not all the time. I don't think every section should have bullet points. If every section has bullet points and you're looking at it from afar, or you can see that all sections have bullet points, there's a sort of a psychology in play there that those have less meaning if they're just used all the time. It's like when you're highlighting something in a journal or a book, and everything's so interesting that you just highlight everything. Well, if everything's highlighted, nothing's highlighted. And so be judicious with your use of bullet points, and make sure that when you do use them, those points or what you're writing there needs to be extra interesting or useful in explaining the process to whoever's reading it. They don't use bullet points in a spurious way. And same thing goes for quotes. They stand out a lot. Use your best quotes. And of course, that's quotes from people who you interviewed or that you did tests with. Quotes from the designer are, unless they're horribly interesting, probably not that useful. And then lastly, imagery being screenshots or pictures of the deliverable you made, or whatever the case may be, to really hammer home the fact that you not only know what you're talking about, because that's the copy's job, but the imagery will reinforce the fact that you're learned about what you're talking about. Because here's an example of what I did. And so a really good example of all this sort of put together is this example that I was able to use with the kind permission of Greg Guma. And we talked a lot about not portfolios necessarily, but we talked a lot about case studies the other night in the fireside chat. And this is from his website, and he allowed me to use the screenshot, and I thought this did a fantastic example of what this previous screen right here just talked about. So if we remember these 5 things, we had the breadcrumb, name of the process, a short subhead, your concise copy, and then sort of imagery, bullet points, quotes. And go back to this slide. Well, what do we see here? So discovery and synthesis, that's your breadcrumb right there. That lets us know that that is the section that it's called a card. That's the section that this card's process belongs to. And so personas is the process, and personas is being, having the breadcrumb here. We know that personas is part of the discovery and synthesis process. Excuse me. Here in this section, this is the Twitter style, too long, did not read portion that sort of boils everything down as much as it can be. And as far as the design interface is concerned, there are some interesting, thoughtful things that Greg did here. So personas is the largest type, or it's the largest font size we have here. So the eye, aside from, if we ignore the imagery for a little bit, the eyes go here first to personas. So that grounds the reader in knowing where they are, what the topic is. And then above that is the breadcrumbs, which is, I think, typically in most design, a bit smaller, and also the font size, the font color is a little lighter. It's closer to this taupe color, or this tan color here. And so it's noticeable and fantastic, design decision to go with this font, these colors, so on and so forth. And then here, the subhead, which is larger than the breadcrumb, larger than the copy, but a bit smaller than the headline here. This is it's also offset in sort of way to where it draws. There's very good use of visual hierarchy going on here. It's very clear what's most important, second, third, fourth, so on and so forth. And this does a fine job of explaining in a, not terse, but a very quick manner, something very easy to read and quick to read, what was found by using personas. And here in the copy, we have two paragraphs that sort of dive into the subject a little bit more and would paint a fuller picture of exactly what's happening, or exactly what was discovered from the creation of personas. And of course, there is a link here, very smart, if whoever was reading this indeed wanted to view the personas. I imagine this would possibly take to a Figma document, FigJam, something of that nature. And so you give the reader the option. You don't force it on them by giving them the full scope of the persona work. And then over here, this is the imagery portion. As stated on this slide here, we have imagery, bullet points, quotes, all these things draw attention, and they get points across very quickly. And this was used fantastically on Greg's site. Aside from, I love the way that he organized these. He put these together. He put them in columns, and from a designer's, design student's point of view, this is in line with other personas that I've seen. And so not only does it really hammer home the idea that Greg knows what he's talking about, and he does, this gives the impression that, or when I see these, I think to myself, these are similar to personas that I've seen before. And that's in my mind, that's a very positive thing to say, because this is in line with the work that I've seen from people in the industry. It includes all the relevant information. It does not include information that's not pertinent to the project. And looking at this, I think, yes. So, looking at this, Greg understands personas, knows what they're for, knows how to use them, knows how to put them together. And so and I know I spent a good amount of time sort of breaking this down, but the very first time I went to Greg's website and I saw this, even if, I because of the visual hierarchy, my eye sort of went to the imagery first, and then I looked to the left, or my eyes went to the left, and I saw the copy that said personas and the subhead and the copy. I knew what this section was. I knew it was personas. And so it adds visual flair, of course. It proves he knows what he's talking about, and indeed he does, but it also is sort of a shorthand. It's a way of doing sort of the same thing. So if you were reading through this and you saw the imagery before you saw the copy, you would know that, without even seeing the copy on the side, that you would say, oh, this is personas. Yes, that looks good. This is how we do things, and then move on to the next portion. So it's an efficient way of delivering information, and I think this is just fantastic design on Greg's part. And let's see here. This is, of course, this was meant to be a bit of a short stream this evening, and this is the last slide, and I would like to say again just how incredibly important it is to plan your work your plan. If you jump into this and just start, freestyling what your case study is going to look like, then it's very much going to be a mess by the time you're done. And because you have to put yourself in the shoes of the person who is doing the hiring. They're very low on time, and they have a stack of resumes from people who may be better than you, may not be as good as you, or they might be just on your level. And so in order to stand out, you need to make their lives easier. And there are several ways of doing that. Attention-grabbing headlines, concise copy, judicious use of bullet points, imagery, so on and so forth. But you won't be able to use these things if you don't know when to use them, why to use them, or indeed what structure they need to be in. And so by starting at the very beginning, starting with your outline and then reducing it as you can, and then coming up with a pattern for what each section looks like, that's not the law, that's not necessarily a rule, but it may be a good idea to think in those terms. And of course, leading up to that, if you're in the pre-case study writing phases, if you're still doing all of your lead up design work, then you can save yourself a lot of time by just not every time, but whenever you make a serious iteration, make a copy of it, throw it in a different Figma file or Sketch or XD, and grab the text tool and write out to the side just a quick note about what changed, why it did, so on and so forth. And it adds a little bit of time to your design process, sure, but it's going to save you time, more time than you put in at the end. It's going to just streamline your process, and you'll thank your past self for having made these decisions. And ultimately, again, just put yourself in the role of the hiring manager, whoever's in charge of that, and think how you can make their life easier. Stand out and make their life easy. That's all there is to it. And ultimately, case studies can be, of course, again, depending on the scope and how large they are, they can be just behemoths that may take months and months to write. However, the more work or the more time you put into preparing ahead of time, the more you're going to set yourself up for success. And so that sort of harkens back to the original point of just plan your work your plan, and you will have a much more streamlined experience doing all this stuff. And that's about it for this evening's stream. It was a bit of a short one. I wanted to not make every single live stream an hour and 30, an hour 45 minutes long. And so, of course, if there's any questions about any of the topics I covered this evening, you can find me on Slack. Of course, I'm on LinkedIn. I will have my portfolio launched soon, hopefully. I did buy the domain and all the hosting and all that good stuff, and I'm working on the HTML and CSS right now. And so when I don't feel like that is a hideous mess, I will give a link out for that. And I do look forward to doing some code review. We might do a stream of that, and portfolio review, things of that nature. But if you have any questions, you know where to find me. Of course, you can subscribe to me on Twitch to get notifications about when I go live, and because it's not with any frequency at this point. I just do it when I want to. So Questions, concerns, let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you soon and have a fantastic weekend.